Today, I'm going to tell you a story that has been unfolding for over 40 years. A story that's not just about technology, but about power. On one side, a forced marriage between hardware and software. On the other, the ruthless strategy of a monopoly called Microsoft. While half the planet believes that computer means Windows, a technically superior system, Linux, was quietly being kept out of stores. Even though there are no official statistics, a large portion of the global population associates Windows with the very concept of computing without even knowing that other operating systems exist. But that, my friends, is another story. The one we're about to dive into is about Linux. Why, despite being technically superior, theoretically free, open, fully customizable, and flexible, it never managed to find space in pre-installed computers or gain ground in the desktop market. In 1999, while Microsoft ruled the desktop world with Windows 98 and its monopoly seemed unshakable, something was born in a small factory in Taiwan that was supposed to change everything. The first computer with Linux pre-installed, sold in mainstream retail stores. It was supposed to be the end of the Windows monopoly. It was supposed to be the beginning of a new era of digital freedom. But it didn't go that way. What happened next is a masterclass in market strategy, psychological warfare, and ecosystem manipulation. This is not a story about code and development. It's a story about power, control, and how to preserve a monopoly even when your product isn't the best one. In this video, we'll uncover how Microsoft turned every attempt to sell pre-installed Linux into a commercial failure, using secret contracts, pressure on retailers, and tactics that border on the unbelievable. We'll look at leaked documents, the infamous Halloween documents that reveal the company's internal strategies. We'll explore the hidden concept of the Windows tax, that invisible fee we all pay every time we buy a new computer. And we'll see how Android managed to become the most successful pre-installed Linux in history by hiding the fact that it's Linux at all. This is the story of how the world's most secure, customizable, and technically superior operating system was systematically locked out of the computers we buy in stores, and how that was never a technical problem, but always a matter of commercial strategy. Get ready, because what I'm about to tell you isn't just about Linux and Windows. It's about how the tech world really works when the cameras are off. But let's start from the beginning. Let's go back to the year 1999. While everyone was talking about the Y2K bug and how computers might stop working at the stroke of midnight in the year 2000, a small Canadian company called Corel was preparing to launch something revolutionary, the NetWinder, the first consumer market computer with Linux pre-installed. This machine had incredible features for its time. It used an ARM processor. Yes, you heard that right, ARM, the same architecture that powers iPhones and MacBooks today. They were 25 years ahead of everyone else. The NetWinder cost $999 compared to $1,999 for a comparable Windows PC. It was manufactured by a company called Rebel.com, and Corel promoted it as a platform for Corel Linux. Corel's system was pre-installed on some NetWinder models, though not all. Rebel.com also offered Red Hat and other Linux variants. Sounds unbelievable, right? A computer that cost half as much and used a technology that would eventually win decades later. So why have you never heard of it? The problem was the software. In 1999, Linux was still a system for tech enthusiasts. There was no Firefox, no LibreOffice, no proper video codecs. Regular users would turn it on, see a strange desktop, realize they couldn't do anything they were used to doing on Windows, and return the machine to the store. Then came the early 2000s, and with them the first serious attempt to bring Linux into the mainstream. It was called Lindows, and yes, the name was no accident. The idea was to make Linux that looked and felt like Windows. The company behind Lindows had a brilliant plan, to create an operating system that was as easy as Windows, but as free as Linux. And that's when the first real war began. Microsoft immediately saw the threat. Lindows wasn't just a lab experiment. Walmart, the largest retail chain in the US, had started selling computers with Lindows pre-installed for just $298. $298 for a full computer. That was less than half the price of a Windows PC. Microsoft's reaction was immediate and ruthless. They launched a legal battle that lasted for years, spending over $20 million just to stop the company from using the name Windows. Eventually, the company was forced to rebrand as Linspire, but the damage had already been done. Legal costs and pressure on retailers had made selling those machines nearly impossible. After the naming lawsuit, Microsoft struck a deal with Linspire, formerly Windows, granting them legal immunity on Microsoft patents. In exchange, Linspire agreed to pre-install Microsoft software and limit open-source features. The community saw this as a surrender and abandoned the project. But there were also real technical issues. Linux computers at the time struggled with hardware. Dial-up modems, the main way people accessed the internet, often didn't work because manufacturers didn't release Linux drivers. Power management didn't exist. Laptops running Linux would overheat and battery life was cut in half. And then there were the multimedia codecs. To watch a video or listen to an MP3, you had to download software from sketchy websites, because the codecs were covered by patents that Linux distributions couldn't afford to license. But what was happening behind the scenes was even more interesting. In 1998, internal Microsoft documents were leaked. Today we know them as the Halloween documents. These papers revealed for the first time Microsoft's true strategies against Linux and open source. In one of them, a Microsoft executive literally wrote that Linux was a cancer that attaches itself in a viral sense to intellectual property. Another document detailed the FUD strategy: fear, uncertainty, doubt. The idea was to plant doubt in the minds of consumers and businesses about Linux, even when such doubt was unjustified. But the most insidious strategy was called embrace, extend, extinguish. First, Microsoft would embrace an open standard, then extend it with proprietary features that only worked on their own products, and finally eliminate compatibility with the original standard. This is what they did with Java, with HTML, and what they tried to do with Linux too. The contracts Microsoft had with OEMs, computer manufacturers, contained some very specific clauses. They didn't explicitly forbid the sale of Linux machines, but made it economically disadvantageous. If a manufacturer wanted to sell even a single computer with Linux, they would lose volume discounts on all Windows licenses. Considering Windows was installed on over 95% of all PCs, that meant losing millions of dollars. This is where the idea of the Windows tax was born, a hidden fee we all paid without realizing it. Even if you bought a computer just to install Linux, you still had to pay for the Windows license. Manufacturers didn't sell PCs without an operating system because Microsoft charged license fees based on the number of machines produced, not the number with Windows actually installed. Then, in 2008, something huge happened. Acer, one of the world's biggest computer makers, was about to launch a line of netbooks with Linux pre-installed. Just a week before launch, Microsoft contacted Acer and threatened to revoke all Windows licenses if they went ahead. Acer canceled the entire project within 48 hours. These kinds of pressure tactics were so widespread that eventually the European Union stepped in. Between 2004 and 2007, Microsoft was fined €497 million for abuse of dominant position. One of the results was the obligation to offer a browser choice screen in Windows, but the side effect was that European PC makers gained more freedom to sell Linux machines. But Microsoft didn't stop there. They began paying retailers directly to discourage Linux PC sales. Best Buy, the largest electronics chain in the US, had internal instructions telling staff to warn customers against Linux, claiming it was too complicated or not compatible with anything. Meanwhile, Microsoft was paying incentives to stores for every Windows machine sold. The so-called Microsoft tax has been estimated at between $50 and $100 per computer sold, money we all paid whether we liked it or not. But the story of pre-installed Linux was about to take an unexpected turn. In 2007, Asus launched the EPC, a small laptop that cost just $299 and came with Linux pre-installed. It wasn't designed to compete with traditional laptops. It was a completely new category, the netbook. The EPC was a huge success. In the first year alone, it sold over 5 million units. Suddenly, everyone wanted a small, lightweight, and affordable computer. And Linux, in its customized version called Xandros, worked perfectly for basic tasks: web browsing, reading email, and writing simple documents. Microsoft realized the threat. If Linux netbooks continued to sell well, people might get used to a world without Windows. Their response was clever. They brought back Windows XP, renamed Windows Starter, which had previously been declared dead, and offered it to netbook manufacturers at rock-bottom prices, under the condition that Linux was removed. We're talking licenses costing just $15 instead of the usual $50 to $80. In many cases, the same model with Linux was sold at a higher price, with worse support, or relegated to warehouses to discourage purchase. The result? Within 2 years, almost all netbooks came pre-installed with Windows again. Linux had lost another battle. And this wasn't an isolated case. Remember the infamous Get the Facts campaign, 2003-2007? A multi-million-dollar ad campaign where Microsoft promoted independent studies to show that Linux was less secure, less efficient, and more expensive. Many of these studies were commissioned from firms funded by Microsoft. The message? Linux is dangerous and uncertain. Better stick with Windows. It was one of the most aggressive PR attacks ever launched against the open-source world. And do you remember Corel, the company we mentioned earlier as one of the first to try challenging Windows pre-installs? Well, there was a secret agreement with Corel. After launching Corel Linux and trying to build an office suite for Linux, in 2000, Microsoft invested $135 million in Corel. Shortly afterward, Corel abandoned Linux. No one ever revealed the real terms of the deal, but it's clear that it was a move to neutralize a potential competitor. But it didn't end there. Microsoft secretly funded the company SCO Group, which sued IBM and the Linux world, claiming to own parts of the Unix code used in Linux. It was a large-scale legal attack that lasted nearly 10 years. SCO eventually lost, but the legal uncertainty slowed commercial development of the Linux kernel for years. In some countries like Brazil, Russia, and India, some vendors were selling PCs without any OS or with Linux. Microsoft offered secret rebates and favorable agreements to those who returned to shipping Windows pre-installed. In practice, they were paying manufacturers not to sell Linux. Despite all of this, there was someone else trying a different approach. In 2007, Dell announced a partnership with Canonical to sell computers with Ubuntu pre-installed. Ubuntu was different from other Linux distributions. It was designed to be user-friendly, had a modern interface, and most importantly, it had a company, Canonical, behind it that could provide commercial support. At first, things seemed to go well. Dell sold Ubuntu desktops and laptops online and even in some stores. But problems soon emerged. The return rate for Ubuntu machines was 20% compared to 10% for Windows. Dell's call centers weren't prepared to handle Linux-related questions. And then there was the usual issue, software compatibility. By 2009, people wanted iTunes for music, Photoshop for images, Office for work, and games. None of that was available on Linux. Alternatives existed, but they were different, and average users didn't want to learn new software. With the arrival of Secure Boot UEFI in 2012, Microsoft required all Windows 8 certified PCs to have Secure Boot enabled. Manufacturers were allowed to not provide a way to disable it, effectively preventing Linux installation. Only after global protests did Microsoft optionally allow an off switch, but some low-end laptops, like certain Lenovo and HP models, are still locked down to this day. However, there was one American company taking a completely different path. It was called System 76, and it had been selling Linux computers since 2005. Their strategy was the opposite of Dell's. Instead of trying to convert Windows users to Linux, they sold directly to developers and enthusiasts who already wanted Linux. System 76 didn't just install Ubuntu on third-party hardware. They selected components that worked perfectly with Linux, tested everything thoroughly, and offered expert technical support. Today, they're still around, selling computers worldwide, and they've even developed their own custom distribution called Pop! OS. So why did System 76 survive while others failed? The answer lies in the niche. They weren't trying to sell Linux to your average non-tech-savvy user. They were selling it to those who already knew and wanted Linux. It's an important lesson. Sometimes it's better to be first in a small niche than last in a big market. That said, technical issues remained. Proprietary drivers were a nightmare. NVIDIA graphics cards only worked with closed-source drivers that broke with every kernel update. Wi-Fi on many laptops simply didn't work. Printers were a gamble. Some worked flawlessly, others weren't even recognized. And then there were the patented codecs. To watch DVDs, you had to install libdvd CSS from unofficial repositories. For H.264 videos, you needed codecs that distributions couldn't include due to patent issues. It was frustrating for the average user. You'd buy a new computer and couldn't even watch a movie. While Linux was still struggling on the desktop, something revolutionary was happening in the mobile world. In 2008, Google launched Android, and few realized that it was, in fact, the greatest success story of pre-installed Linux in history. Yes, because Android is Linux. It uses the same kernel. Many components are the same, but Google chose never to say it. They talked about a mobile platform, an Android ecosystem, but never, ever mentioned Linux. It was a brilliant move. Avoid the stigma that the general public associated with the Linux desktop, while still benefiting from years of open-source community work. And that's the point. For many, Linux is just a kernel or an operating system. Technically true, but for us, who use Linux every day, who live GNU Linux, it's much more. It's a philosophy, a way of looking at technology, based on sharing, transparency, freedom, and mutual support. Google took all of that and hollowed it out. They extracted the kernel, adapted it, and encapsulated it in Android. But they never spoke of its origins. They never promoted it as Linux. Even today, 70% of Android users don't even know they're using the Linux kernel. That's why we say Android isn't Linux. It uses Linux, but it doesn't represent it. This video is about Linux, yes, but not just about installation or distributions. It's about an ecosystem, a mindset, about what Linux really is. And yet, Android proves something fundamental. Linux can work for everyday users, but it has to be designed for them from the ground up. It's not enough to adapt the desktop. You need an experience built from scratch. 3 years later, in 2011, Google tried again with Chromebooks. Again, Linux, but this time disguised as a browser. The idea was simple. No apps to install, just web apps. Gmail instead of Outlook, Google Docs instead of Word, YouTube instead of a video player. At first, it flopped. High prices, slow internet connections, limited functionality. But Google didn't give up. They realized the right target was schools. Chromebooks were cheap, nearly indestructible, and extremely easy to manage. A teacher could control 30 devices from a web dashboard. Doing that with Windows would be a nightmare. The result? A boom. Today, Chromebooks hold 60% of the US education market. An entire generation is growing up using Linux without knowing it. Then came the pandemic, 2020. Remote learning caused demand to skyrocket, a 275% increase in sales in just 1 year. Far from a niche. But the real twist came in 2022. Valve launched the Steam Deck, a handheld PC gaming console. And instead of using Windows, they chose Linux. The Steam Deck runs SteamOS 3.0 based on Arch Linux. But the real genius is Proton, a compatibility layer that runs Windows games on Linux. Simple. The user turns it on, selects a game, clicks, it runs. No drivers, no configuration, no terminal. It just works. Today, over 15,000 games run on Steam Deck. Many were never meant for Linux. And it's the ultimate proof. The problem was never Linux. It was the user experience. If you hide the complexity and offer a smooth interface, people don't even ask what's under the hood. Why, after 25 years, is pre-installed Linux on regular desktop PCs still not mainstream? The reasons are more complex than they seem, and they have little to do with software quality. The first problem is economic. PC profit margins are razor thin, often below 5%. Manufacturers make money by pre-installing trial software, antivirus programs, toolbars, and other applications that pay to be included. On a Windows PC, these bloatware apps can bring in an additional $50 to $100 per unit. On Linux, they simply don't exist because the open source philosophy rejects those practices. The second problem is technical support. Training call center staff for Linux is extremely expensive. A technician who knows Windows can answer 90% of user questions. That same technician, when facing Linux, would need to understand dozens of different distributions, desktop environments, and package managers. It's a logistical nightmare. The third issue is marketing. Microsoft spends billions on advertising and has partnerships with all the major tech media outlets. When a new version of Windows launches, it's covered everywhere. When a new Linux distribution comes out, only a few insiders notice. And then there's the software ecosystem. Companies don't develop software for Linux because there are too few Linux users, and there are too few users because of the lack of software. It's a vicious cycle. But Microsoft no longer uses the same tactics it did 20 years ago. They can't afford to be too aggressive anymore without risking new antitrust penalties. Instead, they use honey instead of the stick. Windows 11 is practically free for OEMs that commit to high volumes. Microsoft 365 is bundled with hardware at extremely low prices. OEMs receive Azure credits to build cloud services. It's all much more subtle, but the result is the same. No major manufacturer sells Linux PCs. There's also a controversial technical barrier, UEFI Secure Boot. Officially, it's meant to prevent malware from loading during startup. In practice, it makes it harder to install alternative operating systems. Linux distributions have to pay Microsoft to obtain signing keys, creating a strange form of dependency. But if you look closely, Linux PCs do exist. Lenovo has a line of Ubuntu-certified ThinkPads, but they're hidden deep on their website. HP launched the Dev One, a premium laptop with Linux pre-installed, but only for developers. Framework sells modular laptops with native Linux support, but they're still niche. In Europe, companies like Tuxedo in Germany and Slimbook in Spain sell only Linux computers, and they're growing. But they remain far from the mainstream. Here are the real numbers today. Linux has 2 to 3% of the desktop market, but powers 96% of the servers hosting the top 1 million websites worldwide. 100% of the world's top 500 supercomputers run Linux. In mobile, if you combine Android and iOS, which is based on Unix, a cousin of Linux, you get 71% of the market. The paradox is this: Linux has won everywhere, except the one place everyone can see it, on the home desktop. But the future might hold some surprises. The tech industry is changing fast, and Windows may not remain as dominant as it seems. The shift to ARM processors has already begun. Apple's M1 chips proved you can build powerful, energy-efficient computers without x86. Qualcomm is pushing ARM for Windows, and there are already laptops with 20-hour battery life. Linux on ARM has been mature for years, far more than Windows on ARM. Then there's RISC-V, a fully open-source processor architecture. It's still experimental today, but in 5 to 10 years we could see RISC-V computers running Linux out of the box at a fraction of the cost, with no royalties to Intel, AMD, or ARM. Edge computing is also booming. All those IoT devices, security cameras, routers, smart TVs, they run Linux. It's a massive market growing every year. And then there's artificial intelligence. NVIDIA, the GPU giant in AI, supports Linux much better than Windows. Most machine learning frameworks are developed on Linux first. This trend could drive more developers to Linux. Windows 11 created new opportunities too. Its hardware requirements are strict. TPM 2.0, the latest CPUs, secure boot. Millions of perfectly working PCs were suddenly too old for Windows 11. That's a golden opportunity for Linux. There are also rumors, still unconfirmed, that Microsoft may move Windows to a subscription model. If Windows becomes a monthly paid service, many users could start looking for alternatives. New players are emerging. Pine64 sells fully open-source computers, both hardware and software. Star Labs in the UK makes premium Linux laptops with elegant design. Tuxedo in Germany is growing fast, offering powerful, reliable Linux machines. And Framework is taking a revolutionary approach. Modular laptops where you can swap ports, keyboards, displays, designed to last for years and built with Linux in mind. After 25 years of history, what have we learned from this long battle for pre-installed Linux? First lesson: monopolies aren't maintained through product quality, but through contracts, exclusive partnerships, and control over the distribution chain. Microsoft didn't dominate for 30 years because Windows was the best operating system. It dominated because it knew how to control the market. Second lesson: innovation often comes from the margins, from small companies with nothing to lose. Corel with the NetWinder, System 76 with developer-oriented computers, Valve with the Steam Deck. Big companies are great at perfecting what's already there. Small companies are great at inventing what doesn't exist yet. Third lesson: timing is everything. The best technology doesn't always win. Linux was technically superior to Windows as early as the 2000s, but it arrived too late to the desktop market. Android hit the mobile world at exactly the right time and dominated. Fourth lesson: ecosystems matter more than individual products. We don't buy operating systems, we buy the ability to use thousands of apps, games, and services. Microsoft understood this in the 90s. Google perfected it with Android. The paradox of pre-installed Linux is this. Right now, as you watch this video, you're probably already using Linux without knowing it. Your Wi-Fi router runs Linux. Your smart TV runs Linux. Your Android phone runs Linux. The servers powering YouTube use Linux. Even your iPhone, though it doesn't run Linux, runs on Unix, Linux's older cousin. Linux has won everywhere, on servers, in supercomputers, in embedded devices, in phones, in cars, even in space. The International Space Station switched from Windows to Linux in 2013. Mars rovers use Linux. SpaceX control systems use Linux. The only place Linux hasn't won is the desktop, the one place everyone can see. But maybe that's actually the most important victory, because it means Linux has become the invisible infrastructure of the digital world. We don't see it, but it's everywhere. It's like electricity, essential but invisible. And maybe the future of pre-installed Linux isn't about conquering the traditional desktop, but about making the traditional desktop obsolete. With cloud computing, streaming, and always connected devices, maybe in 10 years it won't matter what operating system runs your computer. What will matter is that it works, that it's fast and secure. And in that future, Linux has everything it takes to win.